Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, it's that time again.
It is.
It's always good to sit across and do these podcasts together.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, it's a highlight of my day, my week.
At least you're a good 30 minutes anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So we're doing another biography, a leadership biography, and we try and do these once every little bit, and we're coming around to Dwight D. Eisenhower today.
Yeah.
American president, Army general. He's not typically seen as a top-tier political leader or presidential leader. He's usually ranked, I think, maybe second tier, the B team.
Mm-hmm.
But what are perhaps some things about his life that, first of all, got him into leadership, made him at least a capable leader? And we'll go from there.
Yeah. Eisenhower, like a lot of folks, maybe just kind of the big picture for him, he is one of only maybe five-star generals ever in American history. Few people get to the level that he's at. Like Ulysses Grant was made it to the very top. George Marshall, Douglas MacArthur, Omar Bradley, I think, ultimately does. But Sheridan, I think, after the Civil War. And so typically after some of the biggest wars, such as Civil War and World War II, you've got some military officers that rise to the top rank and capture people's imaginations. And so certainly he does as the supreme Allied commander in World War II.
Yeah.
He becomes a household name and, of course, brings an end to Hitler's Nazi regime and the Japanese war. And so becomes a very, very popular person militarily, and that helps him become president. And of course, I've got a biography in every American president.
Yeah, you've got a whole section.
Shelves,
several shelves worth of.
And you have to kind of wait at least a good decade after they leave office to really get the good biographies, not just the ones that are just promoting and marketing them. But Eisenhower is not necessarily considered as effective necessarily as a George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the Theodore Roosevelt, and some of those kind of folks. But interestingly, his predecessor, Harry Truman, is often rated higher than he is. But part of that is because they went into the red hot part of the Cold War while he was president after World War II. But he brings an end to the Korean War and basically keeps America out of other wars. And so several things. He gets elected twice, which after World War II, there's a lot of times that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Where presidents serve 2 complete terms. And of course, but when you look at him in his growing up years, he seems one of those guys who's kind of wired to be a leader. He's athletic, good looking, popular. People tend to really like him. Even as president, people tend to like him, the people who were around him. But he had his challenges as well. He was a football star, an athlete, but as a freshman in high school, he came down with an infection, and it spread to his groin, and the doctors said the only way to save his life was to amputate his leg.
Oh, wow.
And so he is determined they're not going to do that, and the doctors tell him he'll die if they don't, and he insists that he'd rather die than lose his leg. He's a young, healthy, otherwise healthy football player.
Yeah.
And at one point, he actually begs his brother and tells his brother, just stay at the foot of my bed, and if I'm delirious and unconscious and they try to take me out and cut my leg off, don't let them. And quite a dramatic moment in his life. he does miraculously survive that infection and keeps both legs. And of course, so often you look back at history and say, well, if the medical advice had been followed, if he'd listened to the experts, he would have lost a leg, and I'm sure that his life still would have done some interesting things. But there's no question he would not have led all of the Allied forces
Right.
in D-Day, and would probably not have been elected president. So those sort of twists of history where you think, what if it's just this had happened, or he just listened to this expert advice.
How would things have turned out differently?
And Eisenhower had various things. He moved a lot. He had the misfortune, actually, and he was in the Army during World War I. But Eisenhower kind of had he had sort of the things that made him effective also hurt him in a sense. Basically, he was a great number two man.
Mm-hmm.
He was a great administrator. In fact, I see Eisenhower in one sense, not so much as a great leader as much as a great manager. He was a guy who could handle lots of details. He was ambitious, but he was one of these guys that if he served between the world wars, he served under the two top military leaders in American history, at least at that time, George Marshall and John MacArthur, and not John MacArthur,
Douglas MacArthur.
Douglas MacArthur. Yes.
Come on, if I'm correct,
that's
historical.
That's right. Where's my coffee? And both of those men really enjoyed him. In fact, Eisenhower said that his aim in life was to be so effective as an associate that whenever he was transferred to his next assignment, everybody would be sad to see him go. And he accomplished that. People loved having him as their top lieutenant because he would always make things better. He was always very diligent and hardworking and aggressive and problem solving. He had good people skills. And so the problem was that when World War I came around, the only way to really advance in rank was to be in active duty, to be in conflict. If you're managing an office back behind the front lines, you're not going to rise high. Now your superior officer is going to appreciate you, but you're not going to advance very far. And so he remains a major all through most of the interwar years. And so he's effectively serving other people, but he's not getting a chance to be the main leader himself. And so he basically kind of never gets into the action in World War I. And then after World War I, he's a career military guy, but he's stuck as a major because when there's not a war going on, people tend to advance in rank a lot slower because, for one, there's not as many opportunities to earn that kind of recognition, but also they tend to greatly reduce the Army in the ranks. And so there's way fewer officers and there's fewer positions, and so there's just fewer opportunities to advance. And so he at times he's almost wondering, should I continue? Because there's no opportunity to advance in rank. I've been a major now for over a dozen years, and that's a long time to not get a promotion. And yet everybody really appreciates him. So I see him as kind of a good manager, but not necessarily someone who strikes you as the kind of leader that just takes charge and has to be the main guy. And so for a number of years, he's just kept as a great assistant.
Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll finish up when we come back.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is November 4th through 6th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until October 1st, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
So, Richard, what were some of the, perhaps take us through some of the major points in Eisenhower's career? What really solidified his leadership, for better or worse?
Well, as I said, he was a great lieutenant. And so at one point, he is the right-hand man for George Marshall. And Marshall is really the top military man. And so when it comes to looking for a supreme Allied commander, he's the obvious choice. And in a very famous account, Franklin Roosevelt looks to Marshall, and basically Roosevelt has to decide who's going to be the top American general for the D-Day and that invasion. And it should be Marshall. It's his opportunity. He's not led active soldiers as well for many, many years, and this is the greatest leadership role that any military officer is going to have in that generation. And so, but Marshall, the supreme military man, won't say he wants the job, and so he makes Roosevelt have to decide. And ultimately, Roosevelt just says, I couldn't sleep at night if Marshall was over there in Europe. I need him here with me. And so what happens is then Marshall's lieutenant, Eisenhower, gets a chance. And so basically because Eisenhower's boss was so indispensable
to the president,
that Eisenhower ends up getting the most coveted role in World War II from an American military man. But if you watch Eisenhower just as a leader, so much of what Eisenhower is doing is managing various generals under him. So, for instance, he has to deal with George Patton. Patton is one of the most aggressive military leaders of all time. Foul-mouthed, aggressive, spontaneous, always getting himself into trouble. He's got the British Field Marshal Montgomery, who's very aristocratic and arrogant and obnoxious. And so he's always dealing with these enormous personalities under him. And so much of what he does, a lot of people kind of criticize him. When he was leading the army himself in North Africa and then in Italy, Eisenhower actually, several of his initial battles, he lost. And his army got chewed up. And military strategists tend to look at his leadership as being quite conservative. Because he's spent so many years dealing with logistics and transportation and communication and so on, he seems almost, he leads with that. Whereas a Patton looked at, how do we attack?
Right.
Where can we strike the enemy?
Hit him where it hurts.
Eisenhower tended to be, well, let's not overextend our supply train and our fuel supplies and so on. And let's keep the various generals happy and not fighting among themselves. And so if you look at Eisenhower, he's got some great people, aggressive people working under him, but he's never seen as very aggressive. He tends to be much more cautious and careful and conservative. And so he ultimately wins the war. But then when you see him become president of the United States, he tends to continue to be kind of middle of the road. Instead of standing out and decisively leading, a lot of times he's kind of learned that you can get ambushed sometimes when you do that. So be careful, be cautious. Don't get too aggressive. And so
you would say he was risk averse.
He was fairly risk averse. And so, for instance, and sometimes that's maybe good. For instance, in his day, in the 1950s, when he's president, and the Soviet Union gets the nuclear bomb, there was great fear that nuclear bombs could fall on American cities. And at that time, you kind of want a guy like Eisenhower who's not overly emotional and rash and offensive-minded. You want someone that's kind of calm and is not going to be just pushing the nuclear button option at the first provocation. Yeah, he's the kind of person that is just going to kind of move forward cautiously. The other area two other areas that he's been criticized for as a president. One is that when McCarthy is going around, and Senator McCarthy accusing everybody of being a communist, and grandstanding and getting all the world's attention by finding communists under every bush and behind every closed door. Eisenhower was kind of cautious, Eisenhower loathed McCarthy, loathed what he did, but he didn't just come right out and just call him out. He didn't just hit him head on. Eisenhower's approach oftentimes was just kind of wait him out. He'll hang himself. He'll do a lot of damage and he'll stir things up, but ultimately he'll get to the end of his rope and hang himself, and which ultimately is what happened. But there were a lot of innocent people that were forever damaged and tarnished because Eisenhower didn't just charge into the fray like a Patton would have. A Patton would have said all kinds of offensive things and scandalized all kinds of people, but he would have taken McCarthy on right away. The other area, it would be in the civil rights movement. And although finally Eisenhower does have to get involved, that again would have been a great place for him to, as a leader, galvanize people to say this is the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't. He keeps a distance. Of course, he's trying to. These are some huge, titanic shifts in American society, and so he's not pushing real quickly. He's kind of watching to see how things are unfolding, and again, you could look back. In fact, when he left office, he was about 70 years old or so, and he's at that time the oldest person to be American president. And at that point, he liked to golf a lot, had some good friends he'd golf with, and his health was declining, and so he was trying to take care of himself. But here's some huge movements like the civil rights movement emerging, and he's kind of golfing with his friends. And of course, the person who will replace him is John F. Kennedy, who will be the youngest person to be president at that time. So you have the guy leaving is the oldest president, and the guy coming in the youngest at that point. And so his vitality he just kind of seems like a guy that was conservative and just kind of slowing down and golfing and just not wanting to stir up anything. And so people have kind of looked at him. That's why he's not seen as a top leading president who had the courage just to tackle things like Abraham Lincoln did. But people also have looked back later and said, in 1960, he had about $1 billion surplus in the budget. He tried to be careful not to spend more money than he had and to live within his means. He was a manager. That's what he was.
Yeah. So
he managed the American economy and government well. And
we could certainly do with a bit more of that these days.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing. And I think, we've talked about this before, the difference between a leader and a manager. Leaders are going to tackle problems. Leaders are going to take the lead. They're going to have the courage to confront things that aren't right. Mm-hmm. Managers are going to just say, let's not rock the boat here. Let's not
stay the ship.
Let's not go to any extremes. Let's not take any radical, dangerous options here. Let's kind of play things out. Let's live within our means. And so in many ways, that kind of characterizes the 1950s. There were some political scary moments as the Soviet Union and then China gets the nuclear bomb. But on the other hand, it's the 1950s are a pretty great decade after the war. There's lots of prosperity.
Yeah.
Government's living in the black. You've got 8 years of Eisenhower steadily at the helm, someone that's seen as trustworthy and not irrational, dangerous, playing it safe, a war hero. And so though he represents a decade in American history, the 1960s are looming where things will come unraveled. But Eisenhower's time at the helm after one of the biggest, most devastating war in American history was considered quite a very prosperous era in American history that he guided. And so he's kind of a mixed feeling person. You in some ways you wish he had more aggressively tackled issues and led more effectively. On the other hand, sometimes you realize, well, there are some folks that have learned just to steadily keep your hand at the helm, but not jerk too much to the right or left, and just kind of let history unfold.
So, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for those listening from his leadership? What would you say would be the best thing to apply?
Well, so a couple of things I'd say about him. One is that he, I remember several years ago, well, actually, when I was reading this biography for the first time, I was having to make some decisions. And I'm the kind of guy as a leader that wants to decide, wants to not dilly-dally about decisions that need to be made. And so I've said this before, but probably one of my biggest mistakes would be that I would decide too soon. I would look at all the available information. I'd look at all the available applicants if I was hiring, and then I would take the best person available. I'd take the best option available. The problem was sometimes the best option wasn't yet available. All I was doing was picking the best at that time. And I remember while I'm trying to decide, I'm feeling kind of my innate pressure to just decide, that I'm reading this book. And Eisenhower, at one point, he said a statement I haven't forgotten. He said, "Make no mistakes in a hurry." And he was being pressured to decide, and he was not deciding. He was still getting more information. He was still thinking about it. And so people were pressuring him and saying, well, but leaders decide. Eisenhower, you need to decide. And he made the statement, make no mistakes in a hurry. And when they pushed him for that, he basically said, well, when an accountant makes a mistake, it costs people money. He said, when a general makes a mistake, it costs people their lives. He said, it's too costly to make a mistake when there could be thousands of casualties because I just didn't do my homework. So he said, if I am going to make a mistake, it will not be because I rushed a decision. Now, of course, as we've already seen, that sometimes led him to be too cautious because he didn't want to make a mistake in a hurry. But that also told me there are times when it's okay to slow down a bit, that it's not, I'm only trying to decide quickly, not because I even have to, but because I just don't like things left undecided. And so that was a good word for me. Eisenhower, he was 53 years old when he finally is given the opportunity to lead and to become a general and actually get into the fray, and which also tells me some of the great leaders, like a Winston Churchill and some others, they don't actually get their opportunity to lead, their moment in the sun, until later in life. But they've been patient. They've built a track record. And something I learned from Eisenhower was he kept on building a track record of success. He kept serving in the number 2 role effectively. And sure enough, when history called for a number 1 role, he was ready for that. I see a lot of folks who are not being faithful in their number 2 roles because they want a number 1 role. That's always a mistake. Better to build a track record of, and it's often been said, the best leaders are also the best followers. And so be loyal to your boss. Be supportive. Don't undermine your boss. Don't undercut your boss, and hopefully, if things unfold the way that they're meant to, a time will come when you will get your chance, but you won't have to have a bunch of regret about what a poor job you did when you were the number 2 or number 3 person. There's another thing that he does later in life, for good or for ill, but Eisenhower, when he did become president, he had people liked him. He was a pretty popular person. And so he had a number of friends who were high-level CEOs of companies, self-made people, wealthy people. And so sometimes Eisenhower was kind of viewed as more interested in just golfing with his rich friends than tackling the tough issues in American society. But something that I did learn from him was that Eisenhower surrounded himself with people that were successful in their own right. They didn't have to. They weren't sycophants. They wouldn't tell Eisenhower what he wanted to hear just so that he'd be their friend. These guys had lots of friends. They had lots of success themselves.
They were equals.
They weren't dependent upon Eisenhower for their success. They already were successful. And sometimes as a leader, we tend to put ourselves around wannabes, people that need us and are trying to maybe use us to climb the ladder themselves. And so you can't always trust them. They're going to tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. They have their best interest. They're still trying to climb the ladder, so they will use you to advance their own career. And so Eisenhower, I think he just intentionally just surrounded himself with people that he knew didn't need anything from him.
Yeah.
And so when they gave him advice, he knew that it just came out of a concern for him, and they cared about him. And in fact, his group of friends made a promise to him that if he ever needed them, it was just simply he was really stressed out from negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev or Stalin or something, then he could just say, hey, I really need my friends to go golf with me and get my mind off the stress of this job. And these guys would drop what they were doing. Some of them would literally get on a chartered flight from Europe and head back to Washington so that their friend could go golf with their friend. Of course, they had the means to do that. They had the flexibility in their work schedule. But those were the kind of guys that he got around him. And I think it helped him also have balance, and perhaps helped him not overreact. And of course, there was a lot of doomsday people in the 50s thinking that a nuclear holocaust was inevitable. And he needed to be grounded with some people that had been through crises before and could give him just some real solid advice. And so, I think as a leader, choosing your friends, there'll be some people that just may naturally stand out as a natural friend to you, but also look for people that they don't necessarily need you. Perhaps your equals, perhaps they are very secure themselves, and so they don't need to lie to you and tell you what you want to hear. They'll just tell you the truth. And every leader needs some people like that around them.
Well, that's, I think, a great place to end this look at Dwight D. Eisenhower. So until the next one, I think we'll leave it there.
Good.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.